Hey, so why do you even need to know how to make normal diffs? Well, for OSU standard, any map below 3 minutes and 30 seconds of drain time is required to have at least a normal diff as the lowest difficulty of the spread. Obviously, most songs mappers aside the map are below this threshold, and so most sets require a normal diff. And well, why is this tutorial even needed? Is mapping a normal really that hard? Not really. Mapping normals is extremely easy if you know the fundamentals behind them, which unfortunately a lot of mappers never bother to learn. This is mostly because most mappers see mapping low diffs in general as a chore and either ask others to map them, or make low quality low diffs themselves. This also results in a harder time finding BNs for their maps, since in general, BNs are going to prefer modding maps that require less actual modding, especially when it comes to something as relatively boring to mod as normal diffs. Well, enough rambling, how do you actually make normal diffs? So let me make it clear immediately, this guide isn't going to teach you how to make some amazingly innovative or creative normal diff. It's specifically catered toward those who just need to know how to map bog standard normals for their set and do it easily, so it'll apply to almost any song you want to map. So firstly, let's go through just your basic settings. You want to keep AR between 4 and 6, generally depending on the BPM of the song. For most 180-ish BPM songs, I like to keep AR around 5.5. OD and HP should be set to between 3 and 5, which I usually just set to 4 and 3 respectively because they usually fit any spread. According to ranking criteria, circle size should be below 5, so as long as it's in that range, it's fine, but I usually prefer to have it between 3 and 3.5. For global SV, you almost always want to keep it at 1.0. However, if you're specifically mapping a half BPM song, it can be doubled to 2.0 or anything in between. Now, for the actually important things. Rhythm. New OSU players almost always intuitively listen to the melody when playing the game, so that is the foundation with which you create your rhythm. For most songs, melody is going to mostly center around the vocals with some switching into guitars, violins, pianos, or whatever other instruments. So as an example, let's listen to a couple measures from the song Now on Stage by NoNet. In these first couple measures of the chorus of the song, there's a very clear melody that most people will be paying attention to while listening to it. However, if you place a circle in all these ticks, then use sliders to fill in the held vocals, you end up with this rhythm, which, something you will learn now, is too rhythmically dense for this normal. Normal diffs around 175 BPM-ish, specifically those which serve at the lowest necessary difficulty for the spread, should generally avoid having more than 6 or so passive 1/2 rhythm gaps chained in a row. This obviously also scales with BPM, so the amount of passive 1/2 gaps acceptable depend on the song's BPM. In this case, there are 7 1/2 gaps in a row, which also includes a part with 3 actively clickable 1/2s in a row, right here. So, what gives? What are you meant to do when the melody is too dense for what is appropriate for a normal? The solution to this problem is simplification. For this example, I'm going to simplify my rhythms to ignore slightly less important vocals, like this one, and prioritize those that are slightly more important, like this one. In this case, there are a few ways you can do it, but my preference would be this option. But you might also realize now that with this rhythm, I'm only passively mapping the background vocals right here, that despite not technically being part of the melody, most new players would probably be paying attention to. So to make it clickable, I'll just shorten the slider to be 1/2 instead, and add a circle for those vocals, finalizing the rhythm that I would use for this section of the song. Now there are still some other things you might be asking yourself, like what about the drums? Drums can and usually should be ignored in favor of the melody of the song. For example, on this part, there's a prominent drum on the big white tick that I would prefer to ignore in favor of the vocal on the red tick right before it, since you generally should prioritize just a single layer of the song, the melody, on normals. The only real examples where you would follow drums is if there is some kind of held part of the melody with some prominent drum notes cutting through it. In which case, it's usually fine to map it a little at least. Well, what about when there's no vocals? As I said before, a song's melody is usually centered around vocals, but when they're not present, it's usually centered around the guitar or piano or other instruments. In this song, there's a guitar-only section right here, in which rhythm creation follows the same process I demonstrated earlier with the vocals. Now, with rhythm out of the way, we can move on to our next topic. Distance snap and slider velocity. While the ranking criteria says nothing about distance snap needing to be constant for normals, it's just way easier for it to be. So, along with overall slider velocity being kept on 1.0 for almost every map, you should also keep your distance snapping to 1.0 pretty much always. On slider velocity, again, you also don't technically need to vary it at all, and some people just don't. But me personally, I like to vary my SV slightly for different sections of the map, going from 0.9 to 1.1, depending on the intensity of the section. I generally use 0.9 for very slow parts or intros, 1.0 for normal intensity verses, and 1.1 for choruses or other intense sections. Keep in mind, distance snap scales off of slider velocity, so the overall spacing between sections is also slightly increased or decreased based off of the SV. Contrast. While normals are obviously very simplistic, you still definitely have room for contrast, mainly through rhythm density and the aforementioned minor slider velocity and subsequent minor spacing changes between sections. Rhythm density is typically the most important way of adding contrast in normals, and this is mostly done through having more and wider rhythm gaps in less intense sections with the opposite in more intense sections. As an example, you might add a few 2-beat rhythm gaps in the slowest parts of the song with very few active 1/2 rhythms, while using several passive 1/2 gaps in a row on the most intense sections with no rhythm gap larger than a beat long. That's pretty much all there is to contrast in normal diffs. With the main fundamentals of normal sound, it's time for a list of things you should avoid doing. Things to avoid. Non-linear patterns. New players are terrible at reading, so patterns should be as linear and straightforward as possible with no room for confusion. Confusing overlaps. Again, new players don't know how to read, and overlaps are generally going to increase that reading difficulty. Stack mixing. Players at this level aren't yet prepared to differentiate 1/2 stacks from 1/1 stacks visually, so avoid mixing these together in the same normal. Slider only sections. If you ever watch people play Osu for the first time, one of the most confusing things for them to grasp is how sliders work, as they are more complex of an object than circles to understand at the beginning. So avoid making sections that are very slider heavy, always try to mix in some circles. Large chains of 1/2 sliders. 1/2 sliders are typically the hardest object for new players to understand, so avoid chains of more than 3 of them in a row at all costs. Multiple reverses. New players generally don't have the reaction time to multiple reverses on sliders, so you should avoid using them. Obviously, it doesn't apply to super long sliders though. Rotating in the same direction for too long. It might seem minor, but a common mistake mappers make is going in the exact same clockwise or anti-clockwise rotation for huge chunks of time, and this creates very monotonous gameplay, even for new players, since movement never changes direction. As a guideline, try to change rotation at least once every 30 seconds or so. Complex slider shapes. Normals, especially lowest diff normals, should avoid using any sliders with complicated to understand paths, so just in general, avoid using super complex shapes. Other than that, just try to follow ranking criteria and you'll probably be fine. In case you didn't know who I was, I'm Basensorex, or just Basen. I'm a longtime mapper, modder, mentor, and ex-beatmap nominator, and I've ranked a few normals. For the longest time, I felt there weren't any real helpful tutorials on making normal diffs that were concise or direct enough, and it was also really frustrating in my short time as a BN to have to deny or heavily mod maps just because their normal diffs were extremely subpar, which were the main reasons I was inspired to make this video. I've also consistently received messages from mappers, both new and experienced, who want to know how to make normal diffs, so that was an extra reason for me to just make a video going into detail about it instead of trying to teach every single individual mapper who asked me. Anyways, that's pretty much all I have to say. I'll probably make a few videos on some other extra topics in the future, so look out for those. And with all that, see you next time.